Good afternoon. I am going to read the message of our team, Tita Concepcion and available. Dean Pacifico Agami, Dean Merlin Magallona, Dean Raul Pangalanga, Professor Harry Roque, students and guests, pleasant afternoon. Alexander Hamilton, political philosopher and one of America's first constitutional lawyers, once said that the judiciary is the leaders of the three co-equal branches of the government. He said that the judiciary has no influence over the sword that brings brandies by the executive, but the purse as controlled by the legislature. Thus, having neither force nor will, but merely judgment, must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive for the efficacy of its judgment. Things, however, changed with the promulgation of Marbury v. Madison, the landmark Supreme Court case creating the concept of judicial review. Now, the judiciary is empowered to check on the executive or legislative, nullifying their actions as if they are violating of the Constitution. Interestingly, this principle of judicial review is embodied no less than our 1987 Constitution. As observed by Justice Carmen Morales in the case of Labucal, the words, and to determine whether or not there has been a grave abuse of discretion amounting to lack or excess of jurisdiction on the part of any branch or instrumentality of the government, added to our Constitution. The scope of judicial inquiry broadened into areas which the court under previous constitutions would have normally left political departments to decide. Today, as we commemorate the 25th year anniversary of our 1987 Constitution, it is high time that we look back and see how the power of judicial review has broadened through the years. Thus, it is a great honor for me to welcome you all to this panel discussion entitled 25 Years of God, Grave Abuse of Discretion. With us this afternoon are great constitutionalists of the country who will provide us with insights on how our constitutional law, particularly the principle of grave abuse of discretion in judicial review, has been interpreted and applied in jurisprudence and what will become of this jurisprudence in the future. I would like to thank the Institute of Government and Law Reform under the leadership of Professor Florin Dubai for holding this event, thus providing an avenue for intellectual exercise that will arm us all with knowledge necessary to have a constructive assessment of our Constitution. Good afternoon and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Harlesa. I will first introduce all the speakers and then they will give their lectures in order. Our first speaker is an associate professor at the UP College of Law and teaches, among other subjects, public international law, international humanitarian law, and constitutional law. He is currently the director of the University of the Philippines Law Center Institute of International Legal Studies. He is also the lead counsel in a number of public interest cases. Among these are Julia versus Executive Secretary, where he represented surviving victims of mass rape, commonly referred to as comfort women, in declaring the existing government policy of refusing to espouse their faith for reparation as tantamount to grave abuse of discretion, and in India, Statue Olivares et al. Versus Juan Miguel Arroyo, a class action suit in behalf of journalists against the First Gentleman's indiscriminate filing of libel cases to harass journalists and to muzzle freedom of the press. He also represents 15 heirs of the victims of the Ampatuan massacre. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Harry Roque. is one of the college's prominent public intellectuals, reaching out to the public through a column in the Philippine Daily Inquirer and frequently appearances to enlighten the public on the day's legal issues. Ladies and gentlemen, our fourth speaker is Tina Ultraman. Our first speaker will give his lecture, Professor Ariel.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to explain why I am speaking first. Professor Hibay thought my participation is absolutely indispensable because otherwise he would have a billing problem with 3 former deans of the UP College of Law. So he said, you have to speak so that I don't have to explain to any of the 3 of them why one of them went ahead first. So, the only one who's not being dean speaks first. Okay. And secondly, I guess he also invited me here because I have this distinction in the faculty, I suppose. There's only 2 of us from the same batch. And we have the distinction of having enrolled in the UP College of Law in 1986. And we're the only batch that did not have constitution. We had a 2-page document, a 3-page document known as the Freedom Constitution, but we studied constitutional law, including administrative law under Dina Gavin, without the 1987 Constitution. So I suppose that if only because of that symbolic importance that there was indeed a batch in the UP College of Law that went through constitutional law without a constitution, he invited me. For that, I would like to thank him. And of course, the person who did a very good job of reading our obituaries committed that although I am in a panel of very distinguished specialists, she forgot to mention that my specialty is law as entertainment. Now, the reality is, when I got the invitation, I thought Professor Hibay was inviting me to attend as part of the audience. And then I didn't know that he was going to make me speak, which is just as well. In fact, I just came today from the House of Representatives, and I come with good news. The House Committee on Justice, voting 38 to 10, found the existence of probable cause against Justice Mariano del Castillo for betrayal of public trust, among others. Number 1, for plagiarizing at least 31 counts, the works of at least foreign authors in the majority opinion in Binuya, which is Executive Secretary, and also for twisting these plagiarized portions in support of the opposite conclusions of these foreign authors. Foreign authors, in fact, communicated directly with the Supreme Court to inform them that their works were in support of the conclusion that victims of war crimes should have adequate legal remedy, either before domestic courts or under international law. It was never the intention of the plagiarized authors that their work should be used in support of the decision telling the comfort women na kawawa naman kayo, because that's exactly what the court said. Kawawa naman kayo because it is one of those rare instances where there is an obvious violation of a legal right but bereft of legality. So why do I start my very short presentation with Binuya? Well, although we're talking about grave abuse of discretion, number 1, the provisions of betrayal of public trust is in fact one of the innovations of the 1987 Constitution. If you compare the provisions of all the constitutions that we've had, we did not have betrayal of public trust as an impeachable offense in the previous constitutions. And according to the deliberations of the Constitutional Commission, they intended betrayal of public trust to be a catch-all provision to include acts, even if they are not penal in nature, would nonetheless affect the fitness of an impeachable officer to govern. And that is why, in the deliberations today, much of the debate centered on whether or not plagiarism was grave enough, number 1, to warrant impeachment. And number 2, whether or not it is impeachable at all. Fortunately, an overwhelming number of members of the Justice Committee, 38, voted that impeachment in fact is an impeachable offense, and that the impeachment in this case, involving no less than 32 counts of plagiarism, is grave enough to warrant impeachment against the sitting justice of the Supreme Court. Now, it's also noteworthy to begin with that case because it is the provisions of the 1987 Constitution on grave abuse of discretion that enabled us in the first place to file that petition for Binuya. You know, the story behind the filing of Binuya is I got a call from Nelia Sancho. Nelia Sancho is a Marcos crime activist. She said that one of the lolas attended a lecture I delivered for the IHL committee of the PNRC in Tarlac, and I ended my lecture there with a statement that certainly we cannot allow violations of legal rights to go without illegal remedy. So with that in her mind, she looked for Nelia. She prodded Nelia to contact me for an appointment to find out if there was any remedy for them at all. Nelia called me, I said, sure. I told her to come at 5 because I had a class until 5, but they came at 3. At that time, I was holding what was then the very first class of international humanitarian law, which we offered as an elective, and this was because we had a program in a project in ILS on the teaching of IHL for law professors in the Philippines, and we thought that we should in fact be the first to teach the subject as an elective. Now, had it not been for the fact that they came looking for a legal remedy in my own class in international humanitarian law, I would have told them, sorry po, but it's been too long, and really, this is one of those instances where we just have to pray for redress in the other life. But I could not say that openly in a class on IHL, where I have emphasized, number one, the non-derogable nature of IHL, and number two, the philosophy that no one who commits a grave breach of IHL should go unpunished for his acts. Naturally, if only because of the fact that I was in front of my class, I had to tell the women publicly that certainly there must be a remedy. But had they come at some other time, Binuya would not have been filed. Obviously, the first obstacle was, what would be your course of action? It's been too long. This, coupled with the fact that the Philippine government has been consistent in its refusal to espouse their claims precisely because of the principle of pacta sunt servanda. We agreed to be a signatory and a party to the San Francisco Peace Pact, and under this treaty, we agreed to waive any and further claims for reparation. Certainly, these are very good arguments on why no one can compel the Philippine government to espouse the claims. Well, the rest is history. My point being, it is now the new provisions on grave abuse of discretion that gives hope to those who would otherwise have been hopeless for a legal remedy. And I can tell you that these Malaya lolas certainly are living testaments to this fact. Well, it was also these provisions on grave abuse of discretion that has literally enabled activists like me to come to court, whereas in the past, we would have difficulties in hurdling the test of justiciability on the issue of standing. It was in fact in the case of Francisco, which should have been titled Roque in the first place, had it not been for the fact that Francisco filed his 4-page petition 4 hours ahead of our 80-page petition. And they had this crazy practice that whoever files first will have the title of the case. Of course, after that case, they came up with a new rule in the Supreme Court that it is the substantive petition that will contain the title of the case. Unfortunately, that came too late. And now we have to use the name of Tony Francisco. But it was in that case precisely that we argued that this provision is new, that this provision was intended to put an end to the practice in the past whereby a Marcos Supreme Court simply deferred the exercise of judicial review on the pretense that it is a political question best left to a political organ as specified in the Constitution. We said that this was unacceptable precisely because of our experience under martial law. Ninoy Aquino questioned the factual basis for the declaration of habeas corpus, and the justices, many of them graduates of this institution, simply said, we can't review that. because that's beyond the ambit of political review. And it was precisely this painful experience in our history that led to a recognition that the courts must exercise this power, not as a matter of discretion, in the same way that it is being exercised in the United States, but as a matter of obligation. And therefore, that particular portion of the ruling in Roque, let's not call it Francisco, if only because he does not know if he's pro or anti-corona right now, where Justice Carpio Morales actually said that this is where we cut the umbilical ties, as we've argued, between Philippine jurisprudence and American jurisprudence. American jurists have the option whether or not they will exercise restraint. Ours is an obligation to exercise the power of judicial review. I'm not unmindful of the fact that the exercise of grave abuse of discretion oftentimes has been criticized because it leads to judicial supremacy. In my mind, much of it depends really on good faith of the justices. And that good faith is in fact that when they took their oaths as highest magistrates of the land, they will uphold the supremacy of the Constitution and not any other interest in the manner by which they decide cases before them. We are human beings. It's an imperfect system. But in my mind, it is certainly an innovation that ordinary citizens like you and I can go to court for the enforcement of public rights. In my mind, that ultimately is the best insurance against despotic regimes. Now, I will not really consume too much of your time because unlike the other speakers, I am not an expert. I'm just an activist who benefited from the provisions of the grave abuse of discretion. Thank you and good afternoon.
First, let me thank Harry Roque here for the ruling of the Supreme Court in Roque versus Representatives. But the point is that in most things in life, grave abuse of discretion of God, as Floyd has put it down, is double-edged. Roque versus House of Representatives made it possible for the Supreme Court to save their own Chief Justice from impeachment. Now, Roque versus House of Representatives may also be used by the Supreme Court to save again their own Chief Justice from impeachment. And we have seen this in the last decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Philippine Savings Bank versus Senate, where the court issued a TRO against the disclosure of the foreign currency deposits of the Chief Justice on the ground that the foreign currency deposit law absolutely prohibits disclosure of the dollar accounts. So they issued a TRO. The Senate obeyed it, notwithstanding the fact that the Constitution provides that the Senate shall be the sole power with respect to the trial and judgment of impeachment. So that's my point. God is double-bladed. And of course, like Harry here, I cannot condemn it because 90% of the cases I have handled in the Supreme Court were God-based. So, GAD, GOE. And so I cannot say God damn. I can only say God sakes. And so let me just read to you a few notes which I have scribbled with respect to the effect of God. First, insofar as our politics is concerned. If we look at it from the point of view of political scientists, we can say that the innovation referred to by Rafi here is actually an event in political science. This science is called judicialization of politics. In other words, the judiciary has started creeping into the arena of politics, and it has begun to break down the walls of separation of power. This phenomenon of judicialization of politics was in fact observed by two American political scientists, and they don't even have a gun in their federal constitution, unlike ours. So, is this threat, this judicialization of politics, consistent with Abe Lincoln's definition of democracy, of government by the people, for the people, and of the people? Goes against the American idea, majoritarian idea of Lincoln, since our members of this judiciary think that they live in Mount Olympus and they are above us ordinary mortals. Now, the laws of physics sometimes influence those of metaphysics, so that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So what has happened to our God? Well, since the judiciary has intruded into the arena of politics, naturally there was an equal and opposite reaction from the political arena. And they have also intruded into the judiciary. So, if the politicians or if the political leaders know that the members of the Supreme Court can strike down on the basis of God executive or legislative action, it is sheer naivete to believe that the politicians will leave that alone. They cannot take it lying down. They will also have to invade the arena of the judiciary. Or sometimes, if they cannot attack it openly, they will do it by seduction, which is what Gloria did in our Supreme Court. So, political leaders are always under the strongest temptation to seduce the Supreme Court. The present setup, therefore, is a marriage of convenience. There are constitution. It is an arrangement which combines the best of temptation with the best of opportunity, like a married couple. So, the judiciary intrudes into politics. Naturally, politics will also intrude into the judiciary. And this is what Pinoy has, of course, realized. So we find this impeachment case against Chief Justice Corona, allegedly because of the Supreme Court's decision in Hacienda Luisita. Anyway, it was Chief Justice Artemio Pacaniban who made a very insightful observation that people label the Supreme Court on the basis of its perceived independence from the executive. So, during the martial law period, we had the Marcos Supreme Court. And last term of the Supreme Court, we had a glorious Supreme Court, salvaged only by the independence of Chief Justice Renato Uno. Now, Now, of course, when we think of in terms of legitimacy, as defined by the political scientists, we have to look at the decisions of the Supreme Court in terms of the three aspects of legitimacy. This has been defined by Richard Fallon, a professor of Harvard. He said, well, there are three overlapping aspects of legitimacy. There is legal legitimacy, there is sociological legitimacy, and of course there is moral legitimacy. Legal is, of course, what comes out of the decisions of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the final interpreter of constitutional law. As a sociological concept, however, a distinction must be made between legal legitimacy of a Supreme Court decision and a sociological legitimacy. It is a decision which is deserving of acceptance by the people. And of course, there is the moral aspect where, of course, our moral values will have to come into play. So, if we take a case like, well, let's say, the Castro versus KDC, which is based on God. Is the decision of the Supreme Court authorizing the President to appoint a midnight Chief Justice sociologically acceptable? Is it morally acceptable? These are questions which, of course, you and I can both answer. But the thesis of Richard Fallon is that a decision of the court may be legally legitimate, but it should not be sociologically or even morally legitimate. Then, of course, we have seen this in the United States, where another political scientist, Michael Lauer, from the University of Virginia, considers the premise that the people's verdict in constitutional cases depends more on whether public opinion ultimately supports the outcome than on the quality of legal reasoning or even the craftsmanship of the Supreme Court justices. And so, this dimension was emphasized even by the U.S. Supreme Court itself. In the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, when the Supreme Court said, and I quote, but even when justification is permissive and the opposite legal principle, something more is required, because not every conscientious claim of principle justification will be accepted as such. The court's legitimacy depends on whether the making of legally principled decisions under circumstances in which the principled character is sufficiently plausible is to be accepted by the nation or not. And this is the case because in constitutional law cases, the Supreme Court, of course, interprets the Constitution. But we should not forget that the Constitution is not a lawyer's document. It's not even a justice's document. It is a document of the people. And ultimately, they will be the last arbiter insofar as interpretation of the Constitution is concerned. So, going back to grave abuse of power. Let us look at the justification for the judicialization of politics. This was made by an American political scientist, Neil Lachey, and he theorized, and I quote, that when the public and the leaders of interest groups and major economic and social institutions view the majoritarian institutions as immobilized, self-serving, or even corrupt, it is hardly surprising that they would accord the policy making of judiciaries who have reputation for expertise and rectitude as much or more legitimate as that of the executive or of the legislature. This tendency should only be accelerated when judicial institutions are accorded more respect or legitimacy than other government institutions. Unquote. So the emphasis here is respect and legitimacy. So, with respect to our own Supreme Court, one of our students who wrote a law journal article called the GATT, Grave Abuse of Discretion and Innovation, a mutant judicial power. We can look at it as a mutant. We can look at it also as a guardian of our democratic values, values enshrined in the Constitution, or we can even look at it as a social income of our law officers, myself, of Harry. We borrowed this concept of activism from the Warren Court of the United States in the 1960s, following a philosophy of what they call a living constitution. So, consistent with the duty of checking unconstitutional exercise of political power. For instance, our Supreme Court struck down a negotiated agreement between the executive and the Forum Islamic Liberation Front, where I was one of the counsel. And the court was able to justify this in the name of protecting the sovereignty of the people and their representatives, freedom of information and transparency, and of course, the right of the people to make policy decisions. And yet, the same God, the same innovation, has also checked actions taken by the legislative branch of the government. So, in cases like Garciliano versus House of Representatives, in the case of Granada versus Senate, the glorious Supreme Court ruled that the Senate could not proceed on the basis of the investigation of the Garcia case. Kasi the Senate could not yet republish its rules of procedure. This is based on the tenuous premise that the Senate is no longer a continuing body, unlike the Senate of the pre-martial law era. Then in the case of Mary versus Senate Law Reform Committee, the Gloria Court again blocked the Senate investigation of the NBA and said the regulatory scandal invoking executive privilege. The court has always drawn the line, the Gloria Court has always drawn the line in favor of the executive branch. Then, with respect to the legislature, the court has been ambivalent in SEMA versus Comelec, for instance. The court has virtually negated the principle of stare decisis in the case of the 16 cities, League of Cities. The court initially blocked legislation creating 16 new cities because it had not met the criteria laid down in the existing. Then in the same year, it retreated and accepted the third motion for reconsideration after rejecting the second motion. And even if there was already an entry of judgment means tapos na ang boxing. The Supreme Court later reneged and voted back to its original decision, which held that the law granting city status to municipalities is valid after all. Then, in Aldama versus Comelec, the court struck down Republic Act of 1995-91, creating the legislative district of Malolos on the ground that it failed to meet the minimum population requirement for a city, for a town to become a city. A few months later, the court declared Republic Act 9716, creating another congressional district in Camarines Sur, the district of Dato Arroyo, by gerrymandering, reconfiguring the first and second legislative districts, notwithstanding doubts about the first district's population, and raising allegations of gerrymandering. So, what has this done to the doctrine of stare decisis? This doctrine says that the court should speak with one voice. It does so with finality, logically and rightly, for the highest judicial organ of this court. Speaking with one voice implies consistency, symmetry, and logic. If that one voice is reversed or changed to unusual frequency, it undermines the legitimacy of the court, leading to a vaguer of voices. Next, let me take up the matter of the gun and economic policy. You know very well that our constitution is different from the traditional concept of a constitution as viewed from the eyes of the Americans or from the English. When a constitution is supposed to be brief, it's like a lady's bathing suit. Constitution should be brief, but it should cover the essential parts. And yet, our constitution is not really that brief. Our constitution, aside from the three traditional parts of the constitution, limitation of power, allocation of power, and amendment provisions, our constitution contains economic policies. And so we have provisions of our constitution on housing, on women, on urban land reform, agrarian land reform, economic provisions do with respect to God? Well, these provisions give an opportunity for the Supreme Court to review legislation passed by Congress, which, even if constitutional, may still be struck down as in grave abuse of discretion. So, is this good or bad? Well, as I said, it's both beneficial and bad. But the effect of incorporating so many economic policies in our Constitution makes it relatively difficult for our Supreme Court to indulge in economic policy making, simply because economic policies have already been laid down in our Constitution. On the other hand, it makes it easier for our court to declare a law on economic policy passed by Congress or an executive order passed by the President to be grave abuse of discretion by invoking these economic policies in the Constitution. So, we cannot reduce our Constitution to the level of its American counterpart, and we cannot ask the Supreme Court to declare perhaps legislation passed by Congress to be in violation of substantive due process, simply because economic policies now laid down in our Constitution will make it impossible for our Supreme Court to invoke again substantive due process insofar as economic policy is concerned. So, with respect to the Bill of Rights, however, with respect to the protection of minorities, the Supreme Court can use God to protect the rights of minorities. What did Justice Cardoso say? He said the Bill of Rights are preserved against the assaults of opportunism, the expediency of the passing power, the erosion of small encroachments, the scorn and derision of those who have no patience with general principles, by enshrining them in constitutions and consecrating to the task of their protection a body of defenders. So, fortunately, the Supreme Court can now use God to veto laws or executive orders which may be contrary to not only to the Bill of Rights, but even to the economic and social policies laid down in our Constitution on the ground of grave abuse of discretion. So, by using God, the court can invalidate legislative acts, invoking even the economic policies in the Constitution, which are not self-executive. So, to go back to my point, God is really a double-bladed knife which has been used for good and evil. And so, we have to live with it because it's there in our Constitution. The next thing we have to do is to reform our Supreme Court.
was hoping that our colleague who made the introduction of speakers would have a longer introduction because I was beginning to enjoy my good wife. Let me start with the text of the certiorari power and the Constitution. It says judicial power includes the duty of the courts of justice to determine whether or not there has been a grave abuse of discretion amounting to lack or excess of jurisdiction on the part of any branch or instrumentality of the government. What is excluded here is the discretion of the Supreme Court, who will review the unreviewable. Let me refer to one of the decisions of the Supreme Court in which its discretion is in question. And I'm referring to the decision of the Supreme Court in the Duvia case, which Harvey has expressed authority on. The core argument of the government is on the basis of the reading or interpretation of the waiver clause in the peace treaty with Japan. And when you go over the text of the waiver in the peace treaty with Japan, it says that the government involved, as well as the claims of the nationals, are waived for the reason that Japan was not at the time financially capable of meeting its claims, giving rise to the implication that there will be a time when Japan will be capable financially of meeting all the claims that it has waived. And the discussion of the government should have been a correct reading of the waiver clause of the peace treaty with Japan. And certainly it would have been obvious to the Supreme Court that in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, Japan emerged as a financial power. And certainly the waiver in the peace treaty with Japan is something that is out of date. In other words, the Supreme Court would have exercised its discretion to require the government to go over the text of the treaty and to have a contemporary interpretation of the waiver clause. Moreover, under Philippine law, if you interpret the waiver clause, that would have been set aside as something against public policy. So in the provision of the Constitution that we are discussing, what becomes questionable would be at times the discretion exercised by the Supreme Court as against the discretion on the part of the branch or instrumentality of the government that may be involved. And a number of other cases will show us that it is the discretion of the court itself that is in question as against the discretion being reviewed. It is the primary function of the Constitution as to the distribution of political power in the state. In this sense, judicial function in the Philippine Constitution is political power. Indeed, Section 1, Article 8 of the Constitution defines the judicial department in terms of judicial power It does not speak of judicial function, but the term judicial power is used. In the distribution of the power of the state among the main departments of the government, the Constitution maintains a balancing act by means of the well-known principle of separation of powers and the checks and balances. These principles imply that the Constitution is a system of empowerment as well as of limitation. It is a system of grant of powers and of the limits of these powers in the respective operations in the relations of the main departments with each other. Thus, the Constitution projects the prospect of convergent harmony as well as of contradiction of power. In the interrelationship of the main departments, despite the generalities in the distribution of power. From these classical postulates, the 1987 Constitution strikes radical departures. In providing for the regime of impeachment, the Constitution breaks the fundamental principle and structure of government characterized by the separation of powers. It spells out the extraordinary powers of Congress where impeachment cases as a judicial function in delivering the party from its legislative power. Certainly in the exercise of power over impeachment cases, Congress does not perform legislative function. It is not engaged in lawmaking. Rather, it makes a judgment of conviction or acquittal on specified charges against officials of high authority through the Senate as a court of justice. Through the Senate as impeachment court, the Congress tries and decides impeachment cases on as its sole and exclusive authority. One aspect of the exclusivity of this judicial power is its independence from the Supreme Court on the basis of the rationale that the Constitution itself provides for the impeachability of all members of the Supreme Court. Note that impeachment is the only check and balance on the part of other departments against the Supreme Court. Hence, the extension of the Court's judicial power to impeachment cases removes the Supreme Court from the constitutional scope of the system of checks and balances. The other radical departure from the classical distribution of state power points to the expansion overwhelmingly of the scope of judicial review as provided in paragraph 2, section 1, article 8 of the Constitution. It reads, and I quote, in part, judicial power includes the duty of the courts of justice to determine whether or not there has been a grave abuse of discretion, amounting to not to excess of jurisdiction, on the part of any branch or instrumentality. The certiorari power of the Supreme Court, as thus expanded, comprehends the entire government for the exercise of its discretion, removing the boundary between the discretion of any branch or instrumentality of the government and the transcendental discretion involved in the exercise of judicial review. By way of showing to what extent the scope of judicial review has been reconstructed from the established practice based as well on the historical origins of certiorari. Reference may be made to the traditional concept of the rate of certiorari as limited to review of decisions of judicial or quasi-judicial bodies as determined under Rule 65 of the Rules of Court. By way of showing the extraordinary expansion of certiorari power of the Supreme Court, reference may be made also as an illustration of the point of departure of the 1987 Constitution. U.S. jurisprudence and practice, under which a certiorari petitions elevated to the U.S. Supreme Court come from lower courts. B, review by certiorari is not a matter of right, but of judicial discretion. C, writ of certiorari will be granted only under special and important reasons. And D, as indicated by Justice Frank Murphy in Wade versus Mayo, quote, writs of certiorari are matters of grace, unquote. In practice, the Supreme Court has certiorari domains than the Senate, as in Tanyada versus Angara. It has TRO, the Committee of Justice in the House of Representatives in the Gutierrez case. And the basis of decision in Francisco versus House of Representatives is judicial review power encompasses impeachment proceedings. It is true that despite the wide expanse of certiorari power, the Supreme Court has affirmed the doctrine of political question. And this applies very much with respect to the determination of the Supreme Court of judicial review in the Bedoya case. But note that when the court applies the doctrine of political question, it is a matter of self-limitation of its discretion, and it is not a constitutional limitation that it imposes or ethics. We have before us the prospect of the Supreme Court becoming the impeachment court. If at certain proceedings of the impeachment court, TRO may hang like sword of Damocles. Sword of Damocles is well known more as a metaphor than as legal practice. And of course we know the sword of Damocles as meaningful if it does not fall. But in the Gutierrez case, it really fell. And it may fall in any other part of the impeachment proceedings. All the way to the prospect that the final decision of the Senate in the impeachment proceedings may be TRO and may be the subject of certiorari in relation to the scope of judicial review as covering impeachment proceedings as the Supreme Court intervened in the Francisco versus House of Representatives. The discretion of the court in exercise in Francisco versus House of Representatives does not anyway touch on the question as to whether in impeachment cases the Senate is exercising judicial function. The moment we accept the reality that the Senate is an impeachment court is in the exercise of judicial function, then we have a situation where two bodies under the Constitution exercise the same judicial function if we are to insist on the discretion of the court in Francisco versus House of Representatives. In which case, we have a conflict of judicial functions, one exercised by the Senate and impeachment court, and another by the scope of judicial review. How do we resolve the conflict? I suggest that the conflict will be resolved by the categorization of judicial functions. Judicial function exercised by the Senate and Impeachment Court, since it is certainly in the exercise of judicial function, should be considered as lex specialis. And the judicial review power of the Supreme Court should apply as lex generalis. And certainly, even our law students would know the relationship of lex generalis and lex specialis. And it is therefore on the side of the Senate and Impeachment Court that we have to interpret the judicial function of the Senate, and this should be emphasized for the reason that the Constitution has taken place in departing from the separation of powers by granting a political body judicial function, which is to be characterized as exclusive on the part of the Senate. And therefore we may consider two constitutional bodies exercising judicial function, certainly because of the special aspects involved in the impeachment proceedings. The lex specialis on the part of the Senate shall prevail. It should be added that the independence of the Senate with respect to impeachment proceedings is even emphasized by the fact that the Constitution provides that Congress shall promulgate its rules, and therefore this may be interpreted as precluding the application of the rules of court, which pertains to the judicial function as lex generalis. But the inadequacy of the impeachment proceeding is that on the basis simply of the Senate rules, there seems to be the dominance of the authority of the Senate officer to make rulings. But when you ask the question, what are the legal basis of these rulings, maybe the Senate President may say, it is in my own mind. And that's exactly what he said with respect to the question as to what is the basis for his resolution that self-incrimination shall apply with respect to the question as to whether subpoena should be issued. I am surprised that self-incrimination is involved and succeeded in its place without even identifying the witness and without a witness understanding as a question. So here we have the necessity for Congress to consider that it is demanded of the Constitution that Congress in the exercise of its impeachment power should refer to its duty to promulgate its rules. And I would assume that this constitutional mandate should be interpreted as precluding the application of the rules of court, which of course has been invoked many times over in the present constitution. The reference to constitutional crisis if the Supreme Court will intervene has already begun. And on the basis of Francisco case, there seems to be no opportunity on the part of the Supreme Court to make a reversal in any way with respect to its powers of judicial review in impeachment cases. I think the next time around, if at any stage of the impeachment proceeding, the Supreme Court may issue a hearing, and there are petitions for certiorari that are pending before the Supreme Court. There is no way of expectation that when the Senate arrives at the finality of its decision at the impeachment court, that this will preclude the issuance of ETRO on the basis of the claim that the respondent is suffering from violation of constitutional rights that are involved in the finality of decisions. Well, I think that the certiorari power defined by the Constitution is problematical. As a matter of fact, it is invoked by Francisco decision to be the basis of strengthening the position of the court in affirmation that the judicial review shall easily cover impeachment proceedings. Thank you for that.
I'm the very last speaker, so I'll take the liberty to use the podium, and I'll take the greater liberty of taking an entirely different approach. I will do the approach of the canonical narrative. I see the grave abuse of discretion test as changing attitudes toward the test, as the setting for a clash between two giant theories of the Constitution. The first, which was articulated by Tina Gabin and Harry Roque, is called the counter-majoritarian theory. It romanticizes the power of the courts. It romanticizes the role of judges as the seat of sobriety, as the seat of rationality. The other extreme is what we call popular constitutionalism. It affirms that the people own the Constitution. We, the people, wrote it. We, the people, will say what it is. We will not leave that interpretation to the power of an elite, a secular priesthood called the Supreme Court. However, we have actually a schizoid attitude toward these two theories. And in fact, Tina Gabin's presentation captures it very well. If we like the counter-majoritarian theory, the court's exercise of grave abuse of discretion powers will be called judicial activism. And we applaud the court whenever it exercises its powers. It will order the cleaning up of Manila Bay. It will order the cancellation of timber license agreements. It will order the cancellation of the Manila Hotel sale. In the name of nationalism, we love it. We call it judicial activism. And then if we don't like it, we call it judicialized governance. Or in the dissenting opinion, we call it government by judiciary. So notice, we have competing ideas about one and the same thing. But, you know, the attitude here is not really unique to this episode, which is the impeachment. And I won't touch on the impeachment. And I will leave enough time, I promise you, for a discussion. I got to leave by 3:30, so I'll have to wind up actually within 10-12 minutes. Notice, whenever the court interferes in a charter change, and the court says we are doing this for the name of democracy. Come on. This is an unelected judge stopping a godforsaken plebiscite. How can that be fucking democratic? If you're really democratic, let the people choose. And then why is it that we as a people applaud the court, hooray, hooray, they're defending democracy? Hell no, they're not defending democracy. They are actually imposing their will because we do not trust the people. And that is why popular democracy, our populist constitutionalism, says that the counter-majoritarian theory is actually afraid of the will of the people. They do not trust the people, and come on, in the Philippines, we really don't anyway. I was lining up to vote for the senators. The guy behind me was a tricycle driver, and he was making up his list as we went along because the line was so long. I mean, other people weigh their senatorial choices very seriously. The guy behind me took it so lightly. But for me, no, in my last 8 minutes, I will give you the grand historical survey. It goes back actually to the Philippine Revolution. Look, Jose Rizal and his friends were all liberals. So liberalism for his time was a good thing. They wanted equal citizenship with Spain. They wanted equal protection regardless of race, regardless of color. They wanted guarantees according to law. And that is why they codified everything in the Malolos constitution. That was a liberal constitution. Of course, the Philippine sovereign state was aborted by the Philippine-American War. And what we had was the it was the liberal idea was actually hijacked by the Americans. And here at this part of the story, the UP College of Law comes in. That is why Malcolm really was, played a very important role. Remember, his first graduating class was Jose P. Laurel and Manuel Rojas. Laurel, the chief constitutionalist, Manuel Rojas, the future president. And I don't know if you have seen the photograph. I don't know if it's in the office of Tina Gapi or Gil Magallanes. The little brown boys seated beside the great white father, they had all their legs crossed in just the same angle. And all of them wearing white suits. And law was the embodiment of the legalistic idea. And the bar exam was actually the guarantor of the meritocratic dream. That's why people don't care if the questions are stupid, the answers are dumb. So long as there is no cheating, it's okay. The theory is that anyone in this society, rich or poor, if he works hard enough, studies hard enough, competes on a level playing field, can make it. That is the liberal dream. And that dream was maintained all the way through the war, through independence, and the first crisis came by the late 1950s. I did the lecture for the retirement, for the lecture series in the retirement of the leader. And I said that was a generation of law students who first developed a social conscience. And I realized that was the generation of Lima Gallona and Dina Gapi. That is the birth of legal realism in the Philippines. All of a sudden, people were saying, and this was the time of, remember the slogan of Ramon Magsaysay, then you have less in life, you have more in law. So napapansin na nila that liberal legality guarantees democracy. We know anyway that only the rich can win. Equality before the courts, yeah, that's right, but we know anyway you have to pay your lawyers. In other words, you can guarantee equality as much as you want in the law, but we know the deficiencies of liberalism. And that was the generation which started getting restless. And then by the 1960s, the slogan was different. They who have less in life should have more in life, not simply in law. And it was then hijacked by Joe Masison. Well, of course, by the leftists, including Dean Magallanes. And notice, the assault on liberalism, on bourgeois liberalism, was not from within. It was from outside. It was the Marxist assault. But notice, sino na kinabang sa ideological assault na yun? Who reaped the benefits of all those 2 decades of delegitimizing liberalism? And I call it liberal legality, the idea of the rule of law. It was Ferdinand Edwin Marcos, class 39 of the UP College of Law. He proclaimed martial law. He said, I'm going to reform society. I'm going to go after the oligarchs. I will restore equality to this country. And that is why, in fact, during the first years of martial law, I was then in high school, he was welcomed. And I was an activist here, I was with the Collegian. Nobody wanted to listen to our anti-Marcos ranting. Because again, he hijacked the immanent critique of liberalism and said, look, we all know elections are not working. And Marcos said, sure, I'm going to suspend them. We all know Congress is not working. Sure, I'm going to abolish them. And that's exactly what he did. But notice the backlash. And I have to move faster here. I think we just have 4 minutes. The anti-Marcos opposition now started to embrace legality as the idea. In other words, what was discredited for the generation of the 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, all of a sudden became the ideal for the 1980s. So I remember by the time I was an activist, we call ourselves the lost generation. I entered 74, just sure I hold that. Which is after martial law was prepared, but before Ninoy was assassinated. By the time Ninoy was assassinated, all of a sudden the leftists started talking like Thomas Jefferson. Sabi ko, kaibigan mo na pala yung Mao Zedong ng dati. Aba, na-discover si Jefferson, si Madison. And all of a sudden they were saying, if only we had elections, this won't happen. Aba, sabi ko, elections na naman are important. If only we had an elected Congress, if only we had independent courts. And notice, that is the idea which we codified into the 1987 Constitution. That is what brought forth this grave abuse of discretion clause, this expanded definition of judicial power, this romanticizing of institutions. This, we call them in, those who do comparative law, call this the watchdog institutions. Institutions which enforce accountability, not through elections, but through entities which are insulated from the political process. Because again, we do not trust the political process. So, just by way of conclusion, what we have today is completely surprising for me. I never thought the day would come when popular constitutionalism will be the stuff of Inquirer editorials. Well, I help, you know, I also write a column, so I contribute to the trend. But my point is, when Laila de Lima defied the Supreme Court order and the watch list order, well, my theory was, yeah, sure, that's the Constitution functioning. The court appeals for legitimacy before the public. The president appeals. Let's see who wins. I mean, it's the I mean, whoever calls the bluff and whoever wins wins the day. That is how a democracy wins. But that is the heart of popular constitutionalism. The theory that the Senate has the sole power to try and decide impeachment cases in defiance over the public court is again part of popular constitutionalism. I never thought we will get. I never get to this point of the decline of counter-majoritarianism and the rise of popular constitutionalism. I take it to be that all these theories are actually born out of unique historical episodes. Counter-majoritarianism rose as part of the civil rights movement. If you remember Forrest Gump, the movie where Forrest Gump was lining up for his first day in college, and there was the Governor George Wallace was blocking the entrance of this black girl, and the National Guard had to accompany her going to attend her college classes. They needed counter-majoritarianism to enforce that. Meaning, if you ask the people, they are all bigots, and they will block off all colored people. Come to think of it, including Filipinos. Counter-majoritarianism says, if you go by a vote, sure, you can block off the discriminated groups. But because of counter-majoritarianism, we have a constitution which rises above popular biases, and we can enforce them. And that was the historical episode which gave a boost to this theory. And now the U.S. Law schools are themselves turning to popular constitutionalism because they have a decade and a half of Republican presidents. Their courts are filled with conservatives, and suddenly, if you follow counter-majoritarianism and the power of judicial review, you have got the power of conservative judges prevailing. And now, all of a sudden, they say, look, we've got to listen to the pulse of the people, because purely by chance, the people are more progressive this time around than the judges. The same thing with the Philippines today. Exactly as Dean Magallanes says, if we trust the political branches more, but be more precise, if we trust the president more than we trust the court, then the time is right for popular constitutionalism. Let me pause on this one.
Available for anyone who has questions or open forum. Anyone has a question, just approach the mic and state your name and the question.
The organizer of this forum. I have one question. Knowing what you know now, as assuming we're back to 1986, revolutionary period, all three of you were appointed by Corazon Aquino to become members of the Constitutional Commission with specific instructions to do something about the attitude of the court during the Marcos years. How would you craft the great abuse of discretion clause?
Glory, I will go with the original form. I will not include the word duty. Because now that is the clause being invoked by the court. It's our duty. I will not include, I will not transport the GAP, the Great Abuse of Discretion clause. I will restrict it to Rule 65.
Okay.
Certain areas is Rule 65. Discretion abused by a judge whose discretion in the first place is carefully circumscribed and canonized. Now it is grave abuse of discretion over functions which, to start with, are open-ended subjectivity. So really, you're inviting the courts to second guess pure discretion by a judge. So I'm conservative on this point. I restore the original language, and I will leave it to the advocates to squeeze what they can out.
Well, in my case, I would leave it as it is. I would create a constitutional court, which will become the final arbiter in political questions. So, I would envision the Supreme Court to remain supreme in appellate matters, civil and criminal cases going up for review to the Supreme Court. But in so far as political questions are concerned, my definition of political question would be taken from Baker versus Carr. Then I would elevate it to the Constitutional Court. Anyway, our Supreme Court has always been complaining of overload. And so they need to be relieved of deciding political questions. And the political question should go to a constitutional court composed of both political leaders, jurists, as well as academics.
It might not be easy to deal with the problem from the viewpoint of law students or from law professors. Because the text of the Constitution as it appears now should be contextualized in the context of what happened during martial law. And therefore, you cannot understand the 1987 Constitution with respect to this particular text without referring to what happened in the country and to the people during martial law. But when you speak, therefore, of this problem contemporaneously, you might have a different sociology and political implication than it used to have under the 1987 Constitution publication. And so we have to consider what are what would be the text. Take note that the certiorari power under the context, under the text that we are discussing, the exercise of abuse of discretion power, which really is certiorari, is a duty. As a matter of fact, it might be taken by the court as a duty on the part of the Supreme Court to deal with certiorari cases. And I think the constitutional text speaks of the duty of the courts. And this is quite apart from what you have in the certiorari of Rule 65, which is very limited. And therefore, the context of the constitutional certiorari power is something that can be understood in the light of what happened in the country during martial law. But the question, therefore, is, without martial law, without the atmosphere of concentration of power in the hands of Marcos, would you have the same constitutional text? That is something that we can speculate. Thank you.
Hi, Dean. My question actually flows from Sir Colonel Vice and Dean Pangalangan's statement that we went from counter-majoritarianism to popular constitutionalism. But then we have the grave abuse clause. I'm not sure if my cases are right, but I think in Mabana versus Lopez Vito, the court said, well, that's a political question. It's between senators, and we won't meddle. Then years after, still in the 40s, Araneta versus Dignason comes along. The court initially says, well, Mabana versus Lopez Vito says we can meddle with that. That's a political question. But then 10 days after, they saw that, well, that's not working out. So we'll put our foot in and say that we can, it's of transcendental importance. We can put our opinion on this and say that one group, I forgot which group, the Cuenco group, I guess, did it right. Now, in our case, we put in the grave abuse clause. Then now the courts has to decide. The court has to decide because the Constitution says, well, you have to decide. You can, even though the people now are saying popular constitutionalism, then let our elected officers decide these cases. It's the Constitution that says, well, no, actually, any grave abuse of discretion on any instrumentality of government, and I think instrumentality includes impeachment courts or other, then we have the duty, not just the power, to decide. Is it a case where our Constitution or our, I think it was Chief Justice Poon before who said that it was a knee-jerk reaction of strengthening the judiciary, has precluded us from redefining judicial power for our own generation or in our own terms? Have we calcified it in such a way that how we understood government to be in 1987, that's how it should be right now. That's why we define it further and not just leave it as like in Article 6 or 7, which says that, well, executive power, we don't define it. Legislative power, we don't define it. Well, now, judicial power, we define it. And that's it. I mean, you can't, there's no wiggle room for that. Grave abuse, we can always check it from our courts.
I think the problem you have presented is a matter of national debate in the United States. The question is whether the constitutional text should be interpreted as the framers understood them, or whether the constitutional interpretation would go with changing times and circumstances. And I think that there is so much life in saying that the constitutional text should go with what the sociological and political implications they will have at the contemporary times. And therefore there might be a departure from the constitutional interpretation as the framers did with their intention at the time that they drafted the Constitution. I think that what we have now in the certiorari power of the Supreme Court in the present Constitution would favor the interpretation of the Constitution that would take into account the contemporaneousness of the necessity for constitutional limitations of power.
Well, both. So what you're saying is that the 87 formula froze things. and does not leave us enough room to.
Well, does it? I mean, that's the question. Does it freeze things?
For me, it's always it's for the courts to interpret. That is why for me, revising, the proposal of many critics of the grave abuse laws is to remove it. For me, even if you remove it, if the judges still want to use it, they will continue finding it. It's all a matter of the judicial attitude toward what they think is their goal, is their mission. So they will still get to do what they're doing now. So it's not in the language, it is in the mindset. That is why.
I think the problem with deleting the grave abuse innovation is with respect to the danger of violations of human rights. And this has been a continuing problem in the Philippines because well, we must admit that the Supreme Court, especially during the term of Chief Justice, has been an activist in protection of minority rights. And of course, you know very well that in the Philippine situation, it is the minority which even very few individuals whose human rights have been trampled upon in the name of humanity. And so the problem with deleting the grave abuse power that has been constitutionalized is the protection of civil and political liberties of the minority. And of course, that is a problem in almost any society. It is much more significant in the Philippines, simply because of the economic and social demography that we have here. Where power is limited only to the apex of our demographic triangle. And most of us Filipinos belong to the base of the triangle. And if the court takes an activist position, it would be the only institution which would protect the rights of the powerless sectors of our population. Since power is concentrated at the top, then we might have a problem protecting the rights of the minority unless we can have an institution to protect or preserve our human rights. So I believe that in the Philippine context, the God provision is still important insofar as
Protection.
protection and preservation of human rights is concerned. Not to mention the fact that somehow if the court is socially oriented, they can give substance to the economic and social policies that have been enumerated now in our present constitution. And the God provision would come in handy for an activist court to at least redistribute and reshape power so that it will be much more dispersed instead of being concentrated as well in the Philippine society.
I think so far we have presented the problems as independent of what is going on in legal education. I am always asking my students whether they have inventory of membership in the Supreme Court or not. And I will leave the class if they don't have any ambition for leadership, in particular the membership in the Supreme Court. And I was asking our dean whether we should expressly convert UP Law School as a training ground for national leadership, in particular the training of jurists. We are not training jurists, we are training litigators. And so take note of what are the wider implications of this in society. If all of you are litigators, you are going to occupy the law firms. And of course, certain law firms can be provincial. And therefore, we have to make a connection of what is going on in the judiciary with respect to the intellectual training of the judges occupying the cases. But it's not a matter of objective criteria that we are suggesting. It's a matter of the spirit of leadership, service, and activity that can be internalized by the law school in my students. Take note of what kind of legal education we have. I don't think that we have a genuine law school insofar as there is no law faculty to be called in its own degree. And there are very few law schools, but most of them are bar review centers. There is no training in jurisprudence. And so take note of what will the law school produce. The situation now with respect to the status and conditions of the administration of justice from the viewpoint of the people is far from what is going on in training of jurists in the law schools. Because they are not training jurists, they are training litigators, they are training members of the law firm instead of lawyers. So I think if we speak of reforms under the Constitution, we have to speak of the most active element in the legal profession, namely the law schools. In other countries, when you speak of the law school, they produce the epitome of lawyers. But here, well, I don't know how to put it. What is the epitome of a Philippine lawyer? I suppose you would like to define the epitome of a lawyer as a graduate of this law school. But I think that we should need to examine the premises of legal education in the first place when we come forward to see what is the situation of the administration of business. And when you come to consider the legal education from this standpoint, you will see the importance of criticalness, of the progressive development of the law on the basis of a critical attitude of the law schools. The law schools are supposed to be the intellectual sector of the legal profession. But if you don't have full-time law faculty, there is no such thing as legal education. And so I wish that we can localize the larger implications of constitutionalism, whether it is authoritarian or military. We have to come home to our ground, namely, what are we doing in the law school? Thank you.
Again, thank you to our panel members, and thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will join us again in our next